On the morning of July 2nd, 1937, somewhere over the Central Pacific, Amelia Earhart was trying to find an island so small it felt less like a destination and more like a clerical error. Howland Island was a skinny strip of coral and sand sitting in the middle of the ocean, the kind of place you could miss if you blinked, sneezed, or simply trusted the 1930s to provide reliable radio coordination, which, as we will learn, was a generous and emotionally dangerous assumption. The plan was supposed to be simple. Not easy, because nothing about flying thousands of miles over open ocean in 1937 was easy, but simple in the way that a very bad idea can still be explained in one sentence. Fly from Lae, New Guinea to Howland Island, refuel, and keep going until Amelia Earhart has become the first woman to fly around the world. Now, that would be headlines, speeches, photographs, maybe a book deal even, and definitely a few men explaining how impressive it was despite being unladylike. Because history always finds a room for a man with opinion and no useful skills. Now, Earhart and her navigator, Fred Noonan, were flying a Lockheed Electra 10E, a beautiful silver aircraft packed with fuel tanks, instruments, ambition, and just enough communication confusion to make future historians chew through pencils. The U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca was waiting near Howland, sending signals and preparing to guide them in. On paper, this was the part where the modern world would flex its muscles. The machines, the maps, the radio, the navigation, and the government coordination. All the shiny tools of a century convinced it had finally gotten clever. Unfortunately, the Pacific Ocean had not received that memo. Now, Earhart could not see Howland. She could not get a clear fix from the Itasca, and the ship could hear some of the transmissions, but the communication between them was a mess of missed messages, technical mismatch, and the kind of bureaucratic optimism that says, surely everyone understands the plan, right before no one understands the plan. And then came one of her final known transmissions. They were on a line running north and south. In practical terms, it likely meant she and Noonan believed that they had reached the correct navigational line, but did not know whether Howland was above them or below them. So they searched along it while the fuel tricked down and the ocean kept looking exactly like ocean. And then silence. And that silence had been roaring ever since. Because Amelia did not simply disappear. She was swallowed by the Pacific, yes, but also by fame, by gender expectations, by the myth-making machine, by a country that loved a daring woman as long as it could turn her into a product. After she vanished, America did what America does so often when faced with a tragedy it cannot solve. It built an industry around not knowing. You had books, documentaries, expeditions, radio signals, bones, aluminum fragments of the plane, conspiracy theories, even secret prison camps, spy missions, blurry photographs, and enough new evidence headlines to make the phrase lose all legal meaning. But before Amelia Earhart became a mystery, she was a person. And that's where we need to start. Not with the static and not with the last flight, and definitely not with the theories, but with a restless girl who looked at the 20th century and saw a world confidently telling women to sit down, be quiet, and please remain ornamental, and decided that she would rather fly. Welcome back to Naked History, the show where we rip the fig leaf off the past and occasionally find a propeller, a publicity contract, and an entire society having a nervous breakdown because a woman wore trousers. I'm Dylan Gassaway, and today we're going to be talking about Amelia Earhart. Not just Amelia the missing pilot, and not just Amelia the classroom poster, and definitely not just Amelia the inspirational quote with goggles, but Amelia the restless kid, the nurse's aide, the social worker, the pilot, and the woman whose life keeps getting flattened into a question mark. This is the story of the woman, the plane, and the mystery machine that took them where they needed to go. Amelia Mary Earhart was born on July 24, 1897 in Atchison, Kansas, which is exactly the kind of place history likes to use as a launch pad before throwing someone directly into the sky. She was not born into aviation because aviation barely existed. When Amelia was a child, airplanes were not seen as sleek symbols of modernity. They were still more like lawn chairs with engines attached by guys who looked at gravity and said, I can fix her. And the Wright brothers did not fly at Kitty Hawk until 1903 when Amelia was just 6 years old. That means her childhood had overlapped with the birth of practical flight itself. One day, the sky belonged to birds, weather, and mythological people making bad decisions with wax. Then, suddenly, humans were up there too. Not comfortably and not safely, and definitely not with beverage service yet, but still up there nonetheless. The world Amelia grew up in was changing fast, with cars, telephones, movies, electricity all coming onto the scene at the same time. Women's suffrage starting to become a political PowerPoint in the country, and with mass media, modern advertising, and the modern celebrity being born. Basically, the 20th century kicked open the door and said, all right, nobody relax. Now, Amelia herself was not exactly built for the quiet domestic wallpaper life. As a child, she climbed trees, hunted rats with a rifle, and collected newspaper clippings about women doing unusual things, and generally behaved in a way that made respectable society reach for its emergency smelling salts and its pearls. And that's one of history's most reliable genres. Girl behaves like a person, and adults panic. Now, at one point, Amelia and her sister built a homemade roller coaster off the roof of a tool shed. This is the kind of childhood detail that sounds very adorable until you remember it involves children voluntarily constructing a gravity-based injury machine. Amelia crashed, as one does with a homemade roller coaster, got bruised, and reportedly came away thrilled by the feeling. Before airplanes had entered the chat, she was already looking at speed, height, and danger with a little too much curiosity for anyone's comfort. Now, that doesn't mean she was destined to fly. Destiny is what we call hindsight when we get lazy. But it does show a pattern. Amelia wanted motion and she wanted space. She wanted a life with fewer walls in a world where she was born into had walls everywhere, especially for women. The proper path for a middle-class woman in her youth was narrow. You behave, you marry, and you manage the home. You keep your opinions small enough to fit inside of a teacup. Amelia looked at that script and, in spirit, if not exact wording, seems to have thought, cute. Is there another draft? Amelia did not fall in love with flying the first time she saw an airplane, which is important because history loved to sand people down into clean little origin stories. We want the child to see a plane, hear a violin note from destiny, and instantly know their purpose. But Amelia's first impression of an airplane at a state fair, which was apparently not awe. She thought it looked like a rusty contraption, which, given early aircraft, was a very fair review. Now, aviation in the 1910s and 1920s is not the sleek corporate inconvenience we know it today, where you pay extra to choose a seat and then spend 2 hours wondering if the person in front of you has legally reclined into your soul. Early aviation was raw, loud, and dangerous. It was experimental in many ways and frequently had one bad gust away from becoming archaeology. Planes were fragile and weather forecasting was limited, so the navigation was primitive. Pilots flew by maps, landmarks, instinct, and confidence. The kind of confidence that makes insurance companies stare out windows and reconsider their profession. For women, though, aviation offered something rare, a loophole. The ground had rules. The sky, though, had fewer. Not no rules, of course, because men were absolutely still hanging around airfields asking whether women were emotionally suited for flight while simultaneously smoking near fuel and crashing into fences. But aviation was new enough that old hierarchies had not fully hardened around it yet, and that meant women could sometimes push into the field before society finished building the gate. And that's where women pilots before Amelia became famous. Eric Quimby, Bessie Coleman, Ruth Law, and others had already flown in a world that had treated them like novelties, threats, or circus acts with better hats. Amelia was not the first woman to look at the sky and want in, but she arrived at a moment when the aviation, celebrity, and mass media were beginning to fuse into something powerful. The airplane was no longer just a machine, it was a symbol. It was speed, modernity, danger, national pride, the technological swagger of a nation, and the promise that humanity could now make bad decisions at higher altitudes. And then Amelia saw a stunt flying exhibition in California and something clicked. A plane swooped low, an engine roared, and the air shook, and Amelia was hooked. Not politely interested, not mildly inspired, but hooked in the way people get hooked when the thing they've been looking for finally introduces itself with a noise complaint. She took her first flying lesson in 1921 from Nada Snook, a pioneering woman aviator in her own right, and soon bought her first plane, a bright yellow Kenner Airster named the Canary. And honestly, if you're going to defy gender expectations in a flying machine at this time, it might as well look like a banana with a death wish. Now, Amelia cut her hair short, wore practical clothes, and worked jobs to pay for flying, and quickly became the kind of woman newspapers could not decide whether to admire, market, or scold. So naturally, they did all three. Now, Amelia Earhart did not become famous simply because she was a good pilot. And that sounds dismissive, but it's not meant that way. She was capable, brave, disciplined, and serious about aviation, but fame is not just achievement. Fame is achievement plus timing, image, media hunger, and money. And someone asking nearby, "Oh, can we sell this?" For Amelia, that someone was George Palmer Putnam, a publisher, promoter, and professional hype architect. If publicity had a cockpit, Putnam was in it wearing a scarf. In 1928, Amelia was invited to join a transatlantic flight as part of a crew, though she did not actually pilot the plane across the ocean. Wilmer Stoltz flew it, and Lewis Gordon served as a mechanic. Amelia herself later understood the absurdity of being celebrated for a flight she had not controlled. She was famous in that moment, less of what she had done technically and more because of what she represented visually and culturally. But the press went wild. She was a woman. She looked a little bit like Charles Lindbergh, and America had gone feral for aviation heroes. And the media loves a simple story it can slap across the front page. Woman crosses the Atlantic works. Woman passenger on flight becomes symbolically important because of media, gender, celebrity, and aviation are all having a complicated little dance together. Does not fit as well above the fold. So Amelia became famous almost overnight. She was nicknamed Lady Lindy, which sounds like a compliment until you notice it defines her through a man. And this is where her story gets complicated in a very modern way. Amelia was used by the publicity machine, but she also used it right back. She posed for photos, gave lectures, published books, and endorsed products and cultivated an image. That short hair with a leather jacket, the calm smile, and the practical confidence. She became a brand before most people had the language for what that meant. Now, was she packaged? Yes. Did she benefit from that packaging? Also yes. Was the packaging sexist? Probably, constantly, yeah. Did she exploit it in a way to get her into the air and promote women's independence? Absolutely. And that's not hypocrisy, that's strategy. Amelia lived in a world where men controlled most of the money, newspapers, airplanes, opportunities, and microphones. So she did what many ambitious women across the country have had to do. She learned how to turn the cage into a ladder. But there was still one problem. Her first great fame came from a flight where she had not been the pilot, and Amelia knew it. The public may have been satisfied with the symbol, but Amelia herself needed substance. And in 1932, she went back to the Atlantic to make her legend real. On May 20th, 1932, 5 years to the day after Charles Lindbergh began his famous solo transatlantic flight, Amelia Earhart took off from Newfoundland in a red Lockheed Vega. She intended to fly to Paris because apparently when aviation history sets a bar, the correct response is to point at it and say, "Fine, but let's make it more dramatic." The flight was brutal. The weather had turned ugly fast and ice had formed on the wings. Mechanical problems appeared and flames constantly came from the exhaust. The altimeter fell, the visibility was terrible, and the plane drops suddenly without warning. This was not the clean, heroic version of aviation we sometimes imagine from old photographs, where everyone has goggles, cheekbones, and a jaunty scarf. This was a woman alone over the Atlantic at night in a small aircraft that was actively trying to become part of the ocean. And it's worth pausing on that, because modern flight has this very soft and very specific ways. Today, if the Wi-Fi flickers over Ohio, people start composing legal threats. Amelia was alone over the Atlantic fighting fatigue, weather, ice, mechanical failure, and with no guarantee that anyone would ever know she went down if the plane failed. This is not inspirational poster bravery. This is white knuckle, teeth gritted bravery. The kind where history had better appreciate what you're doing because your aircraft is making noises that feel legally questionable. Now, she did not reach Paris. Instead, she landed in a field in Northern Ireland where a farmer reportedly asked if she had flown far. And that may be one of the greatest understated questions in aviation history. Amelia, having just crossed the ocean by herself, could essentially answer, "Yeah, a bit." And with that flight, she became the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic. This time, no one could dismiss her as a passenger, and this time she had flown the plane. The medals came, the headlines came, the invitations came, and the legend stopped being only publicity. It now had engine oil on it. And over the next several years, Amelia set more records. She flew across the United States, she flew from Hawaii to California, she lectured, wrote, and encouraged women to enter aviation and other fields where society had hung a big dusty sign reading "men only," usually installed by men whose greatest technical achievement was owning the sign. Every flight she made was a record, a publicity event, and a political statement all in one. The sky was not just a place she traveled through, it was where she argued with the world. One of the difficulties with Amelia Earhart is that we keep turning her into whatever we need. To some people, she is courage. To others, feminism. To others, sheer recklessness. To others, it's an unsolved mystery with a propeller. The real Amelia is harder to hold because real people do not neatly fit inside the little display cases we build for them when they become famous. She was ambition, but ambition is not the same thing as carelessness. She was image conscious, but image conscious is not the same thing as fake. She was a celebrity, but she was also a working pilot. She challenged gender norms, but she also moved within the racial and class limits of her time, and her version of women's advancement often centered women with access, whiteness, education, money, and publicity. That does not erase what she did, it just makes the picture more honest. And honest pictures are always more interesting than the ones we polish until they look like commemorative plates. Amelia became famous during an era obsessed with speed, machines, records, and firsts. The 1920s and 1930s loved aviation records the way modern people love true crime documentaries and arguing online about restaurant reservations. Who flew higher, who flew farther, who crossed the ocean, who did it fastest, who did it first. Aviation records were not just athletic feats, they were national bragging rights, technological proof, newspaper gold, and sometimes gender politics with a cockpit. For women, every flight was also an argument. It argued against the doctor who said that women were too fragile, the editor who said that women were too emotional, and the husband who said it was not ladylike. In the entire sagging furniture warehouse of social expectations built to keep women close to the ground. When Amelia flew, she was not just moving through air, she was punching holes in the ceiling. And in the mid-1930s, she became associated with Purdue University as a counselor for women students and a consultant in aeronautics. Purdue supported her aviation work, and funding connected to the university helped acquire the Lockheed Electra she would eventually use for her world flight attempt. The plane was sometimes described as a flying laboratory, which is a beautiful phrase because it makes the Electra sound like science with wings. But by 1937, it was also something else. Amelia's next big statement, her biggest public challenge, and the machine that would carry her into the last chapter of her life. The goal was to fly around the world, roughly around the equator on a longer and more punishing route than simply looping the globe at a friendlier latitude. Because apparently once you've crossed the Atlantic alone, the only reasonable next step is to look at the entire planet and say, all right, fine, you're next. Now, the world flight was a logistical monster. It involved thousands of miles, multiple continents, weather systems, fuel calculations, navigational challenges all on their own, several political permissions, and the general personality of a nightmare spreadsheet. The first attempt began in March of 1937, heading west, and it didn't last long before the Electra was badly damaged on a takeoff incident at Luke Field in Hawaii. And there's something painfully human about that moment. The grand machine age triumph, the carefully publicized leap into history, the great world flight that was supposed to prove endurance, technology, and modern confidence, all of it interrupted by the plane essentially tripping over its own shoes before leaving Hawaii. The Electra had to be shipped back to California for repairs, which is the kind of delay that would make any reasonable person consider whether the universe was trying to send them a memo. Amelia, though, didn't quit. And depending on your temperament, this was either deeply admirable or the opening act of a Greek tragedy with better tailoring. The plane was prepared and the route was changed. The second attempt began later that year, this time heading east. By the time Amelia and Fred Noonan reached Lae, New Guinea, they had already covered a tremendous distance across multiple continents, oceans, heat, fatigue, bureaucracy, and aviation conditions that make modern airport delays look like a mild inconvenience with overpriced sandwiches. And also, Fred Noonan deserves more than being remembered as the man who disappeared with Amelia. He was a skilled navigator with serious experience, including maritime and aviation navigation. He knew celestial navigation, he knew the work. He's not just some random guy that was holding a compass upside down and hoping the vibes would carry them to Howland. But even skilled navigation has limits, especially when the target is a tiny island in a vast ocean and every piece of the plan depends on precision. Now, the next leg from Lae to Howland Island was one of the hardest of the entire journey. Roughly 2,500 miles over open Pacific Ocean with no meaningful landmarks and no alternate airport waiting politely with runway lights and a sad sandwich shop. There was just ocean, math, fuel, and radio coordination, and Howland Island sitting out there like a speck of lint on a blue tablecloth. Everything had to work. The navigation had to work, the radio communication had to work, the coordination with the Itasca had to work. And when history requires everything to work, that's usually when the one small gear looks around and says, "Oh, I'm actually about to ruin some lives." Now, the more that you understand Howland Island, the more absurd the final leg becomes. Finding Howland Island from the air after crossing the Pacific is like trying to find a dropped contact lens in a football stadium during a power outage. It was there, technically, but technically is not a navigation strategy. The island was tiny and the ocean was enormous, and Earhart and Noonan were arriving after a long, exhausting flight in a heavily loaded aircraft with fuel, becoming the most important character of the story. The Coast Guard cutter Itasca was stationed near Howland to guide them in. The ship was sending radio signals and Earhart was transmitting, but the communication between them became a tangle of signal strength, frequencies, direction finding, antenna issues, and misunderstood procedures. It was not one grand dramatic failure, it was a cluster of smaller failures forming a conga line toward disaster. And that is often how catastrophe works. Not always one obvious villain twirling a mustache in a control room, but a stack of assumptions, limitations, bad luck, and genuine human confusion. Someone thinks the other person understands the frequency, and someone assumes the equipment will behave. Someone believes the signal will be heard clearly, and someone is technically correct in a way that helps absolutely no one. And somewhere in the middle of that, the plane is running low on fuel over the Pacific. Now, Earhart's last transmissions suggested that she believed that they were near Howland, but she could not see the island. She reported being low on fuel, and her final confirmed message indicates that they were flying on a line north and south, likely searching along a navigational line of position. This wasn't irrational. If they believed that they had reached the correct line but did not know whether they were north or south of Howland, flying along that line made sense. The problem was that the island was tiny and visibility was limited, and the ocean was huge, and the fuel is not a renewable emotional resource. The Itasca heard her transmissions but apparently could not hear the ship clearly enough, or could not use its signals effectively enough to guide her in, and the sky offered no clue, and the ocean offered no mercy. So the signal faded into silence. The search that followed was enormous. Ships, planes, Navy resources, Coast Guard resources, and presidential attention all turned toward the Central Pacific. For days, the ocean became a map of possibility. Maybe Earhart and Noonan had ditched near Howland. Maybe they had landed on a reef. Maybe they were still floating. Maybe they were sending a weak post-loss radio signal from somewhere. Maybe someone would see smoke, wreckage, a wing, a raft, anything. That word, maybe, is one of the cruelest words in any disappearance. Maybe keeps the door open. Maybe keeps families awake. Maybe keeps newspapers printing, and maybe invites strangers to invent endings because the real one refuses to arrive. No confirmed wreckage was ever found. No bodies were recovered, no final note appeared, no clean ending. And because history hates vacuum, theories moved in almost immediately. The simplest and most widely accepted explanation remains that Earhart and Noonan ran out of fuel and crashed into the Pacific near Howland Island. It's not flashy, it does not require a secret bunker, coded spy messages, or a shadowy official named Mr. Graves smoking in a room full of Venetian blinds. It's just tragic. They missed the island, ran out of fuel, and went down. But simple tragedy has never stood much of a chance against the human craving for a plot. So the Mystery Machine started doing what Mystery Machines do. Not transport Scooby-Doo, but it took the absence of an answer and began manufacturing possibilities. After Amelia disappeared, she became a full-time American obsession. The official explanation was never enough for anyone, partly because no wreckage had ever been found, partly because the Pacific was enormous, and partly because people don't like endings that feel like a door slammed in the dark. So alternative theories grew. Some argued that Earhart and Noonan landed on Gardner Island, now Nikomoraru, and survived for some time as castaways. Others claimed that they were captured by the Japanese. Some suggested that she had actually been spying. Others wandered into the tall grass of secret identities, government cover-ups, and blurry photographs that always seemed to prove something only after 3 documentaries and a man pointing at them very intensely. Now, to be clear, not every theory belongs in the same bucket. The Nikomoraru theory has been investigated seriously for decades, and researchers have pointed to artifacts, possible radio signals, and historical clues that they believe deserve attention. It's not ridiculous to ask the questions, but asking questions is not the same as having answers. And with Amelia Earhart, people often get so excited by possibility that they start treating it like evidence wearing a little hat. And that's how the Mystery Machine works. First, there is an absence, then there's a clue, then there's a headline, and then there's a question mark doing the legal work of 10 lawyers. Has Amelia Earhart's plane finally been found? New evidence changes everything. Was Amelia Earhart secretly? No, stop. Put the corkboard down and step away from the red string. The fascination makes sense, though. Her disappearance is everything a culture needs to obsess forever on. A famous woman, a silver plane, a vast ocean, a final radio transmission, a missing body, and a world on the edge of war. And just enough uncertainty for every generation to project its favorite anxiety onto her. In the Cold War, she becomes a spy. In the forensic age, she becomes bones and measurement, and in the cable TV age, she becomes a reenactment with ominous narration. In the internet age, she becomes a thread, a theory, and a comment section where a man named Gary insists the government knows. Amelia Earhart disappeared once in 1937. The culture has been disappearing her ever since by turning her into a puzzle box and then acting surprised when the person inside becomes harder to see. Now, when we talk about Amelia Earhart, we usually begin at the end. We ask where she went, where the plane is, whether she survived, whether she was captured, whether the wreckage is still waiting somewhere beneath the Pacific. And those are fair questions. They're not silly questions, but they're not the only questions, and they may not even be the most revealing ones. We should also be asking why Americans needed Amelia so badly before she vanished. Why women saw possibility in her, why newspapers turned her into a product. why her fame required her to be brave but also palatable, daring but still marketable, and exceptional but not too threatening. Her disappearance is dramatic, but her life was already extraordinary before the Pacific got involved. She entered a field that was dangerous for everyone and openly hostile to women. She made herself visible in a way and in a world that preferred women small. She understood fame as a tool and used it even when the tool cut both ways. And that's the part the mystery often obscures. Amelia did not become important because she had vanished. She vanished after already becoming important. She had flown, lectured, written, advocated, broken records, challenged expectations, and helped carve a space for women in aviation and public life. The final flight matters, because of course it does, but it should not be allowed to swallow everything that came before it. The danger of the mystery is that it freezes her in her last moments. Amelia on the radio, Amelia low on fuel, Amelia searching for Howland, Amelia vanishing into static. It turns her into an eternal cliffhanger, but Amelia was not a cliffhanger. She was a person with contradictions, strategy, courage, limitations, ambition, and a very human mixture of confidence and risk. She was not perfect, and thank God, because perfect people are usually just myths with good lighting. Her life asks bigger questions than her disappearance alone can ever answer. It asks what fame does to a woman who wants freedom but has to sell an image to get it. It asks what progress looks like when it's filtered through newspapers, sponsors, universities, and a public appetite. It asks whether we are so eager to turn daring women into symbols and then act uncomfortable when the symbols turn out to have edges. Now, there is a temptation to look back at the world flight and ask whether Amelia should have attempted it at all. Was she ready? Was the plane ready? Was the radio setup adequate? Was the pressure too great? Was Putnam pushing too hard? Was Amelia pushing herself too hard? And the honest answer is that some of those questions probably deserve a maybe, which is historically unsatisfying but very emotionally accurate. There were risks, and definitely serious ones, but aviation in that era was built out of risk. The whole field moved forward because people kept doing things that hovered between bravery and medical concern. Records were dangerous. The first one always is dangerous. Being first meant that there was no polished path yet, no checklist refined by decades of disasters, and no infrastructure designed around your safety. There was no easy rescue waiting if the machine failed. And Amelia lived on that line between achievement and danger, and she knew it. She wrote about risk. She understood that flying could kill her. She did not need future armchair investigators to inform her that airplanes sometimes fall down. What makes her story difficult is that her courage and her risk-taking were inseparable. The same drive that made her cross oceans also placed her in the danger. That doesn't make her foolish, it just makes her human. We like our heroes sanitized. We want them brave but not reckless, ambitious but not self-promoting, feminist but not difficult, famous but not calculating, and inspiring but not complicated. Amelia was complicated. And good. Complicated people are the only kind history actually has. And that is why The Last Flight has such a hold on us. It is both intensely specific and almost too symbolic. A woman made her name by refusing boundaries, vanished near the edge of what the modern world could track. A celebrity built by headlines became a headline that never ended. A pilot who proved women could occupy the sky became trapped inside of a cultural imagination that keeps asking where she is, sometimes at the expense of remembering who she was. Now, to wrap it all up in a neat little bow, which certainly is what history is doing here, the search for Amelia Earhart has never really stopped. Expeditions have gone looking for the plane, and researchers have debated radio logs, island artifacts, archival photographs, bone measurements, and even scraps of metal. Every so often, a new claim appears that promises to change everything, and sometimes it does add something interesting. Sometimes, though, it adds mostly fog and a press release. But the hunger is always the same. We want the missing piece. We want the object, the proof, and the final answer that lets the story close. That desire is understandable. Mysteries keep us uncomfortable because they deny us the tidy ending. They leave the door half open, and the human brain hates a half open door. But sometimes history is not a puzzle box that always rewards persistence with a satisfying click. Sometimes the evidence is gone. Sometimes the ocean keeps what it takes, and sometimes the most honest answer is that we don't know exactly what happened, even if we know the most likely shape of that tragedy. We know Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan left Leh on July 2nd, 1937, trying to reach Howland Island. We know that they struggled to establish effective radio communication. We know that Earhart reported being near the island and low on fuel. And we know the final confirmed transmissions placed them searching along the north-south line. We know that no confirmed wreckage or remains had ever been recovered. And we know the simplest explanation remains that they ran out of fuel, crashed into the Pacific. But we also know Amelia Earhart lived boldly in a world that tried to make bold women explain themselves. We know she flew when flying was still half science and half dare. We know she became famous in a culture that loved her courage but often tried to package it into something easier to sell. And we know she used that fame to promote the idea that women belonged in the air, in public life, in ambition, in motion. And we know she vanished doing the thing that had defined her public life, pushing towards the edge of the possible. This is the balance that her story deserves. Not mystery without personhood, and not hero worship without honesty. Amelia Earhart was not simply a missing pilot. She was a woman who climbed in the machinery of her age. Literal machinery. The public machinery, the gender machinery, and tried to carry it somewhere new. Amelia Earhart's story is not just about a disappearance. It's about fame, risk, technology, gender, ambition, and the strange cultural math that says a woman has to be twice as brave to be taken half as seriously. It's also about how America treats its icons. We build them, sell them, mourn them, flatten them, put their faces on a poster, and then slowly sand off every rough edge until they become that motivational wallpaper. But Amelia deserves better than a wallpaper. She deserves to be remembered as daring, flawed, strategic, relentless, media-savvy, stubborn, and human. She was a pilot who looked at the sky not as a decoration but as a road. She was a celebrity who understood the machine and still climbed inside it. She was a woman whose ending remains unknown, but whose life was never a blank. So yes, we can keep asking what happened to Amelia Earhart. That question's not going to go anywhere. But maybe we should ask another question alongside it. What kind of a world makes a woman vanish twice? Once in the Pacific, and once inside her own legend. So that's it for this episode of Naked History. I hope you enjoyed this flight through ambition, aviation, and the publicity mystery machine. If you liked the episode, follow the show, leave a review, and share it with someone who loves a good unsolved mystery, but also knows the real story is usually standing right in front of the question mark. Until next time, as always, I've been Dylan Gassaway, and this has been Naked History. Remember to keep your maps close, your radios tuned, and maybe don't build a navigation plan around finding a coral postage stamp in the middle of the Pacific. Thank you again for listening, and we'll see you next time in the debrief. Have a good one.